The crude writers next to me and I welcome you to Finding Today in the Past, Writing Relevant Historical Fiction. I'm Carl Soehnlein, or K.M. Soehnlein, and I'll introduce these writers, and we've got lots of stuff to talk about. How many of you write novels that you would say fall into the writing in the past historical fiction? Great. About some of you do, some of you don't. Great. This panel sort of came out of another panel that a year ago I was on, and Elizabeth Costello were on at a different conference, and it drew a lot of people to that conference too, and we thought, oh, maybe we can bring it to Saints and Sinners, because we're always looking for a reason to come back here. And so the way we came together was, through Paul Willis. Hello, Paul, wherever you are, we love you. I sent out some questions and topics to the group. They all emailed back some answers, and I've sort of formed questions from there. So that's sort of the map for what we're doing today. But we'll just be talking to each other and then make some time. I'll try to keep an eye on the time and make time for all your questions too. So that's the plan. Sound good? All right, great. Full bios are in the program, so we're going to spare you a couple of minutes of precious time. I won't read them all. I'll just give you some quick sense of what folks are writing that's relevant to kind of what we're talking today. Elizabeth Costello's first novel was published from Regal House. It's called The Good War, and a dark and intense, lyrical, moody, atmospheric, gritty tale worth a look. I agree. Cheryl Head, who won the Saints and Sinners short fiction contest this year. And Cheryl is a much-published writer whose Charlie Mack Motown Mysteries were featured as a Jeopardy question once. I mean, Cheryl wins the bio, okay?
You win the bio award.
Her novel, Time's Undoing, was shortlisted for the LA Times Book Prize, and many other honors have followed. Timothy Schaffert publishes historical fiction novels, including most recently the Titanic Survivors Book Club, The Perfume Thief, and a graphic novel coming up. Is that right?
Yeah, cool.
Okay, exciting. And finally, Christopher Tradowsky also published his first novel last year, Midnight at the Cinema Palace, published by Simon & Schuster. And we have St. Paul, Lincoln, DC, and Portland and San Francisco in the house. So we are here from far and wide for you all. Okay, let's get going. Cheryl, I'm going to start with you because you had when I was sent out my questions to y'all, you said that you didn't like history classes in high school or college, but now you doubt that you'll write anything else. So what changed? When did that happen? What's the appeal?
The main thing that changed is I'm old, so my school was segregated when I went to elementary school and junior high school, and not so much high school, but I didn't read about myself. So I knew about the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, but I didn't know anything about enslaved people and, the diaspora and all that stuff. So once I got hold of it, and I was telling Elizabeth, I wrote a World War II book, and then I just became fascinated with all the missing stories that have been in the canon that we get taught in school, that we talk about in social media and on the newscasts. And I now just want to close the loop. The things that have happened before, it's a loop. Come back to us over and over again, and I want to be able to say, see that happened before, and especially for young people who think they're doing it for the first time,
As the young always do.
Aren't they cute?
Bless their little hearts.
And Liz, let me come to you next. You said, looking back from the present, we're in a great position to create a story. We know how things ended up, so we can work with or against what actually happened. So I wanted to ask you about your novel, The Good War, and how you worked with or against, quote, what actually happened.
It's funny, I was like, did I dig myself a hole with that question? Because I could really go on in multiple directions, but I thought I might just focus on something that happened in the 1964 section. So just to back up, my novel is a dual narrative. It's set in the summers of 1948 and 1964. And in 1964, my character, Charlotte Gall, is sitting around with some friends, and they're talking about the missing Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, the missing civil rights workers, and she and her brother are pretty sure, that they're not going to be found. But a friend of theirs seems to think that they will be, and as a reader, you know that they weren't found, and you know that what we're thinking a lot about, I think, right now, is that the struggle for civil rights is a struggle of life and death, and of course we're seeing that again now. And I think I used that in the book to say that Charlotte and Ed, who had lost people in the Second World War, were sort of already attuned to this idea of that kind of loss, whereas their friend Katie had a more sort of optimistic view. And so there's a little thread, a minor thread in that section about them, and there's a moment when Charlotte's with her mother, with whom she has a lot of conflict, and she hears about that the bodies have been found, and it sort of is ominous, and it sets up a sense in the story that something is about to be revealed about her family history, I think, anyway, looking back. But yeah, so I think, anyway, you could talk a lot about that. But that's one of the pitfalls also of writing historical fiction. I think you could also go to sleep at the wheel, like, oh, we already know that, the dream of the good war, right? That, oh, the good guys won, so there's no more story there, But it's always a little more complex.
Yeah, yeah. So both Cheryl and Liz have written about World War II, and Timothy, you have as well. You actually described your books as being at the intersection of war and entertainment, World War I, the Spanish-American War, and World War II. So I guess the question I wanted to start with you is, what is it about war that has ignited your interest over and over in these books?
Well, I never would have guessed I would write about war. I mean, it seemed like something, old men do, right? So, and I'm an old man, but I didn't. So the first time I brought war into the story, I had no intentions. I was writing about, so Omaha had a World's Fair, a much sort of smaller and less famous than the Chicago one that preceded it, but that was in 1898, and I wanted to write a kind of a realist approximation of the Wizard of Oz's days in Omaha. If you remember, he's described as being a master ventriloquist in Omaha before he gets in a balloon. And of course, in the movie, it says, there's the big balloon that says State Fair, Omaha. And so then I kind of started blending all of that. And the thing about that summer of 1898 was the Spanish-American War in Cuba, and there was a lot of souvenir paraphernalia that said, remember the Maine, which was the famous line at the time. Nobody really remembers the Maine anymore, but the Spanish-American War isn't really one that we study too much. So I just found myself, because there was a certain level of patriotism and celebration and anxiety during that particular summer, I did end up researching that and weaving that into the story. And then the other ones weren't supposed to be war novels either, but their proximity to war ended up putting the characters there, I guess. Because originally the perfume thief was going to be, I was going to start with her 100th birthday, I guess, and go back through her life. And I didn't do that. But I ended up figuring out that during World War II, I would have had her in Paris. And so that's what the novel became ultimately. So.
Thank you. We're going to get more into all that. Christopher, welcome. So your novel Midnight at the Cinema Palace takes place in San Francisco in the 1990s, which you noted isn't historical fiction to you, but it might be to younger readers. And I'm really interested in this because the last novel that I published, Army of Lovers, takes place in the late 80s and early 90s, which isn't historical fiction to me, but when my book came out, I was like, oh, my students think that this is historical fiction. And I was really fascinated by that. We're like, where's the line, So did you think about your novel landing differently for those who lived through the 90s and then those who didn't or don't remember the time?
Yeah, imagine my great surprise and dismay to realize that the 90s is now a historical period. And I'm on a historical fiction panel. Kind of came as an abrupt surprise. But I was kind of trusting when I wrote it that I felt, because I teach a lot, and I have taught a lot of millennials, and I noticed there was a lot of millennial nostalgia for the 90s. They're thinking about their very early years in the 90s. So I was kind of trusting that there would be that millennial nostalgia for the 90s. I wanted to inform them about some things that happened in the 90s that maybe they didn't know about. And also I was thinking about the 90s in San Francisco, I think were special. The 90s weren't uniform, no period is uniform, right? And I do have a feeling that San Francisco in the 90s was a unique and special place, and I wanted to explore that. I was interviewed by a young podcaster who really did not remember the 90s at all. Queer podcaster who was like, yeah, was anything going on in the 90s in San Francisco? So I was like, let me tell you. But also read the novel.
Yeah, one of the things I was asked when Army of Lovers came out is, or not asked, but sort of, I had a statement from a younger reader who was like, I guess I just didn't think people were having sex during that time. Wow. And I was like, girl, we invented safe sex. Of course we were going to have sex. Yeah, thanks, Christopher. So Liz, we're going to come back around to you. And we're talking a lot about where these things start for us, where these historical novels start. And you have an interesting story about the letters, family letters that were the inspiration for the Good War. So let's hear about that.
It was such a tremendous gift. Growing up, I heard a lot about the men on my father's side pretty much all died in the war, prisoners of war in the Philippines, and I sort of grew up with that as the psychic wallpaper of my household. The Greatest Generation. You could never match their sacrifice, right? How can you be? I mean, a dead person is better than any living person can be. They've given the great thing. So I thought a lot about that, and I was already kind of on the path with this book, an earlier version. And all out of the blue, my Aunt Sarah calls me up and says, "Oh, I have this bunch of letters, you among essentially the people on whom I'm basing my characters. Do you want them?" "Oh, no, I wouldn't be needing that, first-hand source." So she sent me a bunch of letters, and among them were some ones from my grandfather, who was imprisoned in Cabanatuan prison in the Philippines. He had survived the Bataan Death March. Anyway, you read my book, you can find out the whole story, or just talk to me after. But he was writing to my grandmother saying, "Why don't you write to me?" And in this collection of letters, I actually didn't really see any from her to him, and doesn't mean there weren't any, but I thought, there's a plot point for you, So that really became a through line for the book. This wounded veteran is pursuing the character Louise and saying, essentially, why didn't you write to him? And that question sort of shapes the plot. So it was a tremendous gift.
Why?
Why does it shape the plot?
No, why didn't you write?
I don't know in life. That's what fiction does. I think, I hope that in the book, well, you'll have to read the book. I hope that it's a little bit ambiguous. I think that it's almost more important that the character pursuing her is so intent on getting an answer, and he's not impressed with the answers that she gives. But it has a lot to do with the weight of the pressures in her family, and her father, her brother, her uncle. This is true of all the men, essentially, in my mom's side of the family all died. So she had lost people already. I think that's part of it. Too painful. She was also working. She was worked at Lockheed. She was, working all day and had 4 kids. And but, you know, is that an excuse not to? And her mother kept saying to her, you know, just pick up a pen and write whatever. And I don't know. It unfolds in the book a little bit more than that. But yeah, thank you for asking.
I love the idea that, like, just because we're writing into history, we don't have to answer everything, right? We can keep showing the mysteries. Cheryl, you, kind of on the subject of research, you talked about digital newspaper archives. And I think right now where everyone just wants to kind of Google or ask Claude for the answers. Tell us what you found in these archives and how that kind of research, like, enriches the work you've written.
So Times Undoing is set in 2 time periods. One is in 1929 when my grandfather was killed by Birmingham, Alabama police. This book is a fictionalized kind of version of what happened with that murder, and a young contemporary journalist in 2019 is going to Birmingham to try to suss out the clues to discover why her great-great-grandfather was killed. And so I kind of immersed myself for the chapters in 1929. I immersed myself in the literature that was involved, what was happening in the world, what was happening in Birmingham and in the United States, and also the black newspapers, which were pretty ubiquitous in the South. I was surprised to learn that. In Birmingham in 1929 had like 12 newspapers. Some of them were newsletters, you know, but a couple of them, there were daily newspapers, a couple of weeklies. And I was reading those newspapers, thank God, online, because they're now digitized, and they're digitizing more and more. I signed up for newspapers.com, and so I was constantly in their database, keywording my grandfather's name, but also keywording the Times and Birmingham. And I came across this just wealth of information about the daily lives of black folks in Birmingham, Alabama, which I don't think I would have been able to find. So, I mean, the best parts of the resource were not even the articles, it was the newspaper ads, the want ads, the church notices, so-and-so's sister is going to visit so-and-so's brother because they just had a baby, $1 for a dress, people were selling their cars, so what kind of car is it, people were talking about the world and what was happening in Birmingham and their segregated lives. But they were also really talking about community, and I discovered a really rich and thriving community, segregated but rich and thriving and prosperous and safe. And so I tried to just organically write those chapters based on the research I'd done. I'm very much a plotter, so the contemporary sections are really built around an outline, but those sections were just written organically.
$1 dress.
Yes.
Yeah, good. I love it. Timothy, you already talked a little bit about how artifacts led to some of your narratives, but is there anything more you want to say about finding stuff in research that sparked a character, story, or a narrative in your books?
I use the digital newspapers a lot too, and those ads, and it just, especially when I was writing the 1890s book, there was the discourse and the
languages.
That's right. And the concept, even the concept of what news was, really informed, especially since Omaha wanted to be taken seriously as a city in 1898, but wasn't quite serious. And so a lot of brothels, a lot of so it was still kind of a Wild West town. So yeah, but also like when I was researching the Titanic Survivors Book Club, which is about the narrator is a guy who owns a bookshop in Paris in 1913, and he had been the library steward of the Titanic, but he got fired just before the ship went down. So this group of people who all had tickets but didn't board join a book club. So it's a kind of, you have to read it for it to make sense, I suppose. But yeah, so he's gay in Paris in 1913, and and so what I learned about that experience was informed by a couple of books right there from the University of Nebraska Press. I didn't look to the press specifically for them. They just happened to have one that included French accounts, doctors' reports on gay men in in the mid 1800s, or around like 1890s, I think, if I remember correctly, and so it was interesting to read how they would interview these men, and they have these quotes, and of course it was all pathologized. They were in hospitals, and the diagnosis was, well, a lot of times they'll talk about love and affection and passion, but it's not real. They're just mimicking straight people, basically. So they don't have the capacity to actually feel those things for other men, and so it's all artificial. And so you gain these insights through these. Rediscovered documents that other scholars. I probably read a lot more scholarship too than I would normally. But.
I love that. A French study of gay men in the 18th.
Yeah, it was called Queer Lives, I think is the name of the book. Yeah, and there was I also read, the other press book was about the writer Rakilde, who she was arrested in, I think that was the 1880s. She wrote a book called Monsieur Venu, and about a woman who dresses as a man and takes a feminine lover, a male lover, and so the book is about gender and all of this. And so she herself would dress as a man, and she got arrested, and she tried to make the case that it was just publicity for the book. But
all right, thank you, Christopher. I'm going to switch a little bit here to something you talked about, which was the 1990s as the sea change that led to the globalized internet age. So you're writing about sort of the time right before that, or just as that sea change is happening. How was it to kind of like send yourself back to before that time, before everything was available for this novel?
Yeah, I do think that the globalized digital age changes the way we write plots. And the cell phone especially kind of changes the way we have to write plots. In the same way that's like in any horror film, the first thing they have to do is like lose their cell phones, so that they're suddenly isolated and in danger, whereas now we're so connected. I don't think narratively we've really grasped how completely the world has changed, and it's like novelists who write about today have to deal with that, but I don't think we've fully grasped how the world has changed in that way. So it was fascinating to me to go back to write before the change took place, and it was honestly it was just really comforting to not have to like worry about any of that and try to integrate it into my novel. And then it also changes the way you construct characters, I think. Because I was listening this week to an Esther Perel podcast, and she was talking about how now we're now more connected than ever, but less accessible than ever. And I thought that was really interesting wording. I mean, what she meant was like we're less emotionally accessible than we have been, and our relationships, which are largely parasocial relationships, are a facade. They're like very shallow, right? And so that changes the way you write a character, right? So my characters, there's lots of coincidences in my novels where they kind of like are pushed together coincidentally, but form kind of immediate bonds. And it's like the opposite of the way characters can encounter each other now. Because the same characters who, in my novel, they get together and they bond, like they're immediately close friends. Writing that today, they'd spend like weeks or months texting each other before they even met or something, and the whole idea of like coincidentally meeting would be completely different. I also did have an early reader who was in my writing group who's a millennial, who while she's reading the chapters as I'm writing them, and some of these coincidences, like they're meant to meet up at the Castro Halloween party in 1993. And my millennial friend was like, I kept thinking, why don't they just text each other?
They could, but then their text would get ignored, so. All right. I'm going to go back to you, Christopher. Talking about gender, your novel centers characters who today we call non-binary. Can you talk about the language around gender in the 90s and how you see that conversation then in your novel versus now at the moment your novel's being received?
I think the main thing I wanted to impress with my novel was that we were having a lot of the same conversations with slightly different language, but the conversation that we're having about gender right now, which is so exciting and so encouraging. It's like I've been able to teach gender studies classes, gender and visual culture for many years. And there is a little bit of, young folks thinking they're kind of like, they've just invented this language, or and they are a little bit hung up on labels and definitions. But the main characters two of the main characters in my novel, I think of them now as gender queer, but when I was writing it, I was trying not to label them at all. And when they talk about gender in the book, which they do, I was thinking about conversations that we were having all the time when I lived in San Francisco in the 90s. And it was such an exciting time to have those conversations about, Judith Butler's Gender Trouble comes out in 1990. And then I wasn't so aware about it, but Bodies That Matter came out in 93. And that book blew my mind. I mean, completely changed my life. And the theory of gender performativity that Butler puts forward. But there were also lots of other conversations going around other thinkers and performers. Kate Bornstein's Gender Outlaw, that was from 94. Or we were talking a lot about third wave, sex positive feminism. Do you remember the Research magazine, the Angry Women issue of Research magazine that had Susie Bright and Kathy Acker and Bell Hooks, and it was a kind of a Bible for the time, I felt. So there were lots of conversations about gender and kind of expanding third wave feminism to be more inclusive of gender diversity. But then it was also really important that we weren't just having conversations, we were also it was in our dress, it was in our comportment, it was in our bodies, it was in our body language, right?
Yeah. Do you get the kind of questions that you got, why didn't they just text each other? Do you get that in someone talking or someone receiving the kind of gender narrative that's inside the book? Like a reader surprise in what they're learning?
I haven't yet, but yeah.
It's interesting, yeah. Timothy, when I asked about creative license in writing history, you noted that historical facts around gender and sexuality can be open to interpretation. So where did you find yourself inventing in your work, I guess, or maybe the line between inventing or interpreting, and how all that kind of stuff plays out around gender and sexuality in the past?
You really do have to fill in the blanks and try to figure out how people who couldn't write about themselves or were trying to, even just for the sake of decorum, people were afraid of talking about sexuality and gender, and so they, so even newspaper articles where the reporter is hinting, and I think it's possible to miss those hints entirely, or even a description of somebody that doesn't identify their sexuality, but you can see from how the person's described and how they're acting, and and the trouble they're getting into, basically what it all indicates. And so, so there's it was fascinating, when I was doing the World War II book, which I didn't really know anything about the queer resistance in Paris until I started doing the research and learning more and more about the individuals who really very powerfully and effectively helped saved Paris, basically. You know, I don't think it's overstating it to say that the queer resistance really was profoundly influential in interesting ways, even as they were living in the underground. So yeah, it's
Is that the perfume thief? Is that the?
yeah. So.
Can I say something about the epistolary approach, the letters, I mean, they were also coded because in World
Right.
War II, you know, they had censors, people were opening the mail,
Right.
and so they were lovers writing to each other using code words and special nicknames and that kind of thing. And in my World War II book, I'm writing about Negro soldiers who really didn't go to the front line. But I have a sergeant who told me in the middle of the night he was gay, so I had to change the whole book. But yeah, but I have a series of letters between him and his lover, and you know, writing the codes, and I couldn't find a lot of letters written by Negro soldiers. There are a lot of letters in other kind of archives, so you know, you have to, of course, use your imagination. But I found it fascinating that the code words that were being used to connect with each other, connect with community.
Yeah, and Josephine Baker was a major
Yes.
player
Yes.
in the resistance, and
Absolutely.
slipping notes. The number of notes that could effectively destroy like morale or
Yeah.
like challenge
Right.
things, just slipped in between pages of music or in magazines, or in like Marcel Moore and Claude Cahoon would walk around,
The Isle of Jersey.
yes, that's what I was trying to say. And just putting little notes in the pockets of the Nazi soldiers, to the point where they were arrested and imprisoned and sentenced to death because of the effect that they were having. And so I think that speaks to the power of those small, which we can, take to heart now, in terms of ourselves as writers and artists and the possibilities that we can provoke and change.
It's not a small gesture.
It's not a small gesture.
It seems to be a small gesture, but it's really not.
Those code words different for Negro soldiers and white soldiers?
Some were. I mean, just finding the words for what men called each other during those times was interesting. Black men use sissy a lot. I didn't see that so much among I saw some archives with Jewish soldiers, and I didn't see that word so much there. But I don't know if that's a Southern word or not. But I saw that word. Sissy.
Sissy.
Sorry.
Let's say it loud
Let's say it
together.
Well, I was so excited in looking at the Omaha newspaper when someone was referenced as an Oscar Wilde type.
I came across something in my research of San Francisco in my book, You Can Say You Knew Me When, where someone referred to gay men as the tight trouser set.
I love this.
Some things don't change.
I mean, that's a pretty great title.
It is.
Liz, you talked about the importance of imagining a character's physicality, not just in terms of describing their looks, but how the bodies of the character kind of affects the plot. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little more about that link between the body and what the character is moving through in the novel.
I mean, I think it's just a good practice for fiction of any kind to consider the embodiment of the character, wherever they are and what the setting is and who's policing that body. And so that's a basic thing. I thought a lot in this book about my character Charlotte is this voluptuous redhead who is projected upon a lot, and I thought a lot about the sort of, the bombshell as subject rather than object. And, for Charlotte, she's also, I thought a lot about just, what you would wear if you have an office job in 1964, and like the sweat pads that make you sweat more and like, all the uncomfortable things. And so, and she also has an experience with her sort of reproductive health that's catastrophic, but it leads her to fall into the arms of the butch next door, who sort of leads her on a wayward lesbian path. But it's an awakening for her, and it's an understanding of desire in a different way, and it's just, I think that's just a really great question to think about all the time, like who's policing my body? How am I in the world? And yeah, so I thought a lot about that there.
I wanted to follow with a related question for you about this idea of likable characters, and in particular in relationship to female characters. Like, we hear about this word a lot, that readers want likability, but how do you contend with that?
I mean, it has been an interesting trip. There have been some reviews of the book that have kind of been like, well, I don't like these bitches. And I'm sort of like, well, that's not my problem. But I mean, to me, I think people are complex. When I read, sometimes I read from the very beginning of the book, and I know that the character is sort of having these negative thoughts about this bartender who isn't serving her just because she's a woman alone. And I can feel sometimes people, like she calls him a Sicilian ape, in her mind, and I can feel this sort of like, ooh, is that racist, or is that, but it's her reactive mind being like, up yours, man, give me a drink. Like, I'm here alone, so what, but Louise especially is a kind of a sharp character. She's a hard, this is the mother character in the book, and I think you learn in the course of the book that she has her reasons, like we all do. But I also thought a lot about, I didn't want it to just be a one-to-one, like, oh, Louise is nasty because something happened to her, or because, again, I think we're more complex than that. And I think I will just say that Zadie Smith has written really interestingly about this question of sort of like relatability or likability of characters. I recommend checking out.
Especially women.
Yeah, so especially women. Yeah, why do we have to be nice? Why do we have to be victims? Do we have to be victims? Is that where our valor lies, our value lies? I don't think so. Thank you very much.
But it's strange that people do talk about liking or disliking a character and that informing their response to the book. And I just don't think in those terms as a reader. Whether I want to be friends with the characters. I'm just reading about their lives.
I don't think so either. And I think of that Bugs Bunny cartoon where they say monsters are the most interesting people. And I think that's true.
Yeah. I think that's generational too, because I think younger viewers and readers, they don't mind a character being kind of, in fact, they kind of take villains and make them into these iconic people, they kind of, and dress up like them when they're in cosplay and stuff. It's kind of fascinating to me. I mean, the Villanelle books, that's Killing Eve, the Killing Eve series. That crazy schizophrenic bitch, I think she's fascinating.
Exactly.
That's likability from the voice of the author.
Say more about what you mean there. Likability from the voice of
Well,
the
if you trust
author.
the narrator of the novel.
I think that's the essential question, right?
Yeah, and that's moving, because, I mean, the unreliable narrator is now a new thing. Gone Girl made that happen, so, and people like to read that stuff.
Cheryl, you wrote one of the comments in our original thread. You wrote, if readers are triggered by the N-word, they shouldn't read my historical works. Do you want to say anything more about like that process of authentic language, or how you work with that in the text?
Yeah, first a disclaimer. I do like young people, even though I'm talking about them. I do like young people. I have young people in my life that I love. Okay, now here's what's wrong with them. They'll come to book readings and they say, I was triggered by, I'm writing crime fiction. People get killed, die horribly. Bad things are going to happen to you. So, but around the N-word, my last couple of books, I'm talking about race, I'm talking about hate groups. And I can guarantee you that people in those hate groups won't say, if I'm coming down the street, oh, look at that African-American woman coming. And so I don't beat it over the head, but I put the word where it makes sense to use, especially in their voices. And, I'm always going to do that because I think it's authentic to know what the language was then and what it is now, frankly, and how quickly that can come back into play.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I've got one more little round of questions, and then we'll take some from you all too. Timothy, when we were talking about relevant historical fiction, you talked about some other ideas that are on your mind: love, beauty, heartbreak. And I'm really interested in the idea of just depicting the beauty of the past that's not just nostalgia or sentimentality. So tell us how to put beauty in our novels.
Well, to go back to Omaha in the 1890s, it was very perverse to read, or not perverse to read it, but it seemed perverse, some of the things they did. I mean, the kinds of parties they had and the things that they ate. I mean, it was not. I mean, especially at the World's Fair, there was a lot of emphasis on beauty and style and art, and it doesn't look beautiful or stylish ultimately or artful, a lot of it, and so that was kind of like the book I'm talking about. This is the Swan Gondola. And there's literally in this, so they built this canal for the fair and have these buildings around it. And there was a swan boat. And you read about it, you see the pictures and think, oh, how kind of sweet and romantic. But I guess it was very noisy. It was gaseous, and it stunk. and and so it wasn't, so there was a lot of that. That attracted to me, like the beauty seemed to be in how everything was falling apart and how everything was, a kind of, it couldn't quite cast the illusions that it sought to do. And so I think those are the things that I'm always looking for, things that I can filter through my own imagination and the reader's imagination and the times that I'm writing in, as opposed to the times I'm writing about. And so I want to be accurate, I want to be historically accurate, but I also want it to be enhanced by imagination, So sometimes it's taking a little detail and then fleshing it out in other ways, that brings the beauty out of something that's otherwise perhaps would seem today tacky to us,
Yeah, nice. Christopher, related question, which is you noted that your primary aim is to capture sensations. I love that phrase, because I think sometimes we think of writing about the past as just like collecting facts, like if you do the research and get the facts. But what are sensations doing, and where are they showing up in Midnight at the Cinema Palace?
So I'm an art historian, a trained art historian, and so I've written historical papers, and to me the difference between writing history and writing a novel or fiction is that in the history, it's most important that you get the history right? It's like you want to tell the history, and it's wiggly, of course, but you want to do the best you can to get the history right. And in writing fiction, what I found was my first aim is not to capture things as they happened exactly, but to capture the sensations of the time. So in kind of like projecting myself back to the 90s, what I wanted to capture most was the images, the sounds, the smells, the texture, the sensory aspects of being in San Francisco in the 1990s. And that came first for me. I wanted the novel to be correct. I didn't want any anachronisms within it, and there are like a few little anachronisms that still bother me, but I let them go, right? But the most important thing was the sensory aspect, yeah.
You also said you wanted to write the queerest book you could possibly write. Say more.
I don't know that I wrote the queerest book I could possibly write.
It's pretty queer, though.
It's really queer,
Yeah.
but maybe I could write a queerer book. That's something to be
Challenges
some ambition.
people.
Yeah. That had to do with my road to publishing fiction was really long and slow, and I was teaching a lot, and so I was like writing the fiction on the side, and I have, as we do, like half a dozen like unfinished novels, or finished but just like failed novels, like in a drawer in a file somewhere, and it was a long slog, a long path to publishing. And when I started this novel, I was just like, how can I write a novel that I can actually finish, be proud of, publish? And I just decided I'm going to write about all my obsessions at once, right? Like, all of it together. So it's like, my obsessions are queerness, San Francisco, the 90s, the cinema. It's largely about movies, and friendship. And it's going to be a love letter to San Francisco in the 90s. It's going to be a love letter to the cinema, and it's going to be a love letter to friendship. And so that kind of that projected the project along. So it's like combining all my my obsessions allowed me to get through it. But it's like, yeah, it had to be the queerest novel I could possibly write for those reasons.
Can I ask one question?
Yes, please.
Which movies do you invoke?
Oh my gosh, every chapter is titled after a movie.
cool.
A mainstream movie?
No, not a mainstream movie. Usually
What
an
titles?
old film noir.
Okay.
And this is where there is this kind of historical aspect to my book, in that the characters in the 90s are obsessed with old movies, Hollywood's golden age, particularly film noir, and then also some French New Wave. So every
And did it have to have a queer element to you?
no, but they were often queered. Yeah.
So Peter Lorre's in there a lot.
No, but Clifton Webb is. Acceptable substitute, maybe?
Awesome. Let's ask the audience. I see hands. Okay, 1, 2, 3. We'll start on this side, and then I'll go over here.
Aside from the book written in the 1990s, would any of you who've written about your time frame want to live in that time frame?
Nope.
That's a challenging I don't know. I don't know.
I think that's a nope for me, too.
I think probably not, but.
Would any of you want to live in last week?
Well, that's the thing. It's like, do we want to be living now? I mean, I'm glad to be here. Don't get me wrong.
When I was writing You Can Say You Knew Me When, there's a part of the book where the character in the 2000s is looking into his father's life in the year 1960, which is before the main character was born. And I wouldn't say I wanted to live in that time, but I was really interested in the people I talked to who were still alive, who had lived through that time. Like, I was friends with some elderly gay men, and I said, I'm researching sort of gay life in San Francisco in the early 60s, and one of them said, the 60s? I'll tell you about the 40s. That's where it was at. And I was like, oh, yeah, take me back to the post-World War II San Francisco. Everyone's, free and done with the war, and they're, like, fucking by the windmills in Golden Gate Park. Like, yeah, I could walk through those paths for, an afternoon.
I mean, I will say something similar about just exactly that moment in the 1948 section, and sort of, thinking about that moment for women who, had gotten, say, new skills as Rosie the Riveters, or, technical skills. And my character and my grandmother herself, on whom I based my character, they worked at Lockheed, and then they worked at the NIH, and, they became chemists. And there was just more, that moment is really interesting, that immediate post-war moment where there's that kind of reckoning. That's where noir is happening. There's a noir theme in my book, too. Kiss of Death, that movie is referenced. But yeah, there's that kind of opening in that moment, after the disaster, and the starting to build all of the things that the current people are tearing down.
That's the America they want us to make great again, okay?
But-
so that, for me, that has no patina for me.
Well, a lot of the government agencies were really what we have that's in some ways the closest to meritocracy and the broadening of the middle class, and that's what was happening
Yeah,
there,
but that's, that whole American dream bullshit is, I'm
Oh,
old,
yeah.
old enough to say it now. That whole splaying of the 50s as this idyllic, wonderful America where people have picket fences and 2 cars and blonde children and everybody's living fabulously does not apply to Japanese people, black people, Latina people, and so I'm always calling that the question, and that's why the history stuff is turning me on now. Because I'm going like, that American dream, that was a scam.
Yeah. Scam and spin. I think you were next, and then you.
Yeah.
I have a question for you, Timothy. In Titanic, you pay a lot of attention to the detail of the confection, the sugar.
Oh, yeah.
Where did you, like, how real was that, and where did you do that research? Because it's down to, like, the taste and very specifics of those things.
Yeah, so the character of Zinnia is really based on my friend Janet, who's her mother's Japanese and was actually in Japan during World War II, and so I've and Janet has introduced me to a lot of like Japanese cooking and foods and candy, and so that was part of my so I've always just made note of those flavors and those and the conventions of Japanese candy making, and then tried to imagine this Americanization of it and how the influence that they would have on each other culturally in terms of confection. And so, yeah, it was a lot of fun to research, and there's also it's well served by language and poetry, right? To be able to play with those concepts and to imagine there's a scene where I learned about whistle candy and where it has a hole so you can kind of whistle through the piece of lozenge, and so that became in the scene where it becomes a romantic exchange of the candy. So it was just I could have written, I could continue to write about candy, and so.
Next question was over here, and then I see you.
Hi guys, so I'm a poet trying to step into historical fiction, and I feel like one of the things that's really like I get stuck on in the process is I love the process of like researching a historical period and then like contending with my own like misinterpretations of that history. So I'm curious for you guys, like, do you find ways to use the like sort of mistaken interpretations of the period to like incorporate them into the stories? Like, for me, like the example of this is I was like reading this very obscure art historian paper about a Song Dynasty painting from 700s. I don't know. Yeah, that's Song Dynasty. Anyways, where it's describing the imperial princess's love affair with a eunuch and how it like brought the sort of court to ruins in a lot of ways. And I was reading it as a like queer and sort of maybe even trans love story, knowing that that's a just way to interpret queerness. And then I then later read a book that was like presenting eunuchs around imperial China as actually very firmly within a masculine ideal. It's just a different alternative, but like it is very conventional and within the power structure. And I was like, well, how would I use like that misinterpretation that I had and place it into a story about this time period? Whereas like for the character, that's not like the interpretation I have is not a reality necessarily. But I think my misinterpretation is interesting.
It's okay. We're there.
Yeah. So I just want to know if you use those
Anybody?
interpretations.
I mean, I think one way to answer that kind of inquiry that you're putting forth is that part of what we get to do is invent, right? That we get to write fiction into history as well as writing history into fiction, right?
To
So
turn it on its head.
yeah,
Yes.
so if you have an interpretation that maybe is being countered by some other scholarship you're reading, but your contemporary queer imagination is being activated and a story is flowing forth from there, like I say, go for it, right? Does that in some way address what you're saying? Yeah. I think, we're always contending with like how much we're adhering to facts. One point of view is you keep the history right and then you invent around it.
Yeah.
But I think sometimes you bend the history to the story that you want to tell. I mean, the whole notion of writing relevant historical fiction can also mean, reclaiming or revising history in some sense for a story we want to reach today, right? Like when I was writing my ACT UP book, I was really worried that I wasn't going to write all the order of the demonstrations that this political activist group was doing in the order they happened on the dates they happened. And then I was like, you know what, there's a really good documentary or two out there that people can get that information, but only I can tell like the emotional story from inside these characters, right? So I do give myself a certain amount of permission.
And then the omissions in the history, since we don't know
Exactly.
them, we can fill in with the
Yeah, yeah, and inevitably you're going to you're taking creative license, and there's no way that everything is going to be totally accurate no matter what.
Yeah.
Leaning back to what is in the record and what's not,
Right.
too. So.
I had a debate with a historian once, and they were just going on and on about oral history is not really history. And I'm going, there were times when people weren't writing the shit down, or they wouldn't let us write it down, or someone wrote it down and they took it away and buried it the way they're doing now.
Yes,
So,
yes, exactly.
I would just reiterate that a history is about facts and a novel is about emotions and sensations.
but facts to me now are so suspect.
Yeah.
What is a fact? And
Yeah.
who's facts?
Yeah.
I'll take this next question here.
Thomas Mann began Joseph and his brothers with, I think this is an accurate quote, "Very deep is the well of the past, perhaps we ought to call it bottomless." So if you as writers of history were to go farther into the well of the past, obviously that would remove you from things that are familiar and of our time, but also it would mean you would have to move to a different place because this country only goes so far back. So that would be a different kind of learning. So say you decided to go farther into the well of the past, how, from what you have learned in writing about a closer past than the more distant past, how, from what you have learned in writing the books you have, would that apply to moving farther into the past?
That's another kind of stumper of a question in a way, really. It's like, that leads back to questions of sources and invention and your choices. If you're just looking for inspiration, maybe you go on an archaeological dig and you pull out a shard and then you build a whole work of fiction around that. But yeah, I think I like what you're saying. To me, there's a quality about what you just said that sort of recognizes that a time is a setting, and it is a world, and whatever we're writing, it's world building, and you're also contending with a contemporary reader's assumptions about that moment. But yeah, I guess my answer would be we would have at it and make stuff up.
Say you were decided that you wanted to do that, would you select a character and let that ground it, and so you began to think of that character in a particular place and culture and what was going on? Or would you select an event and then try to think about what it would be like to live in a period of those events unfolding?
I think that you could do it. It's a yes and. You could do it either way. I'm very character driven myself. I tend to have an experience of a character, but sure, an event. Why not?
A well-known historical character, or would you pick someone that was unknown and anonymous?
I prefer the unknowns myself, but I also like this idea. I haven't written such a book myself, and I don't have to be the only one talking here, but I will just say that I always like the idea of sort of a character who is maybe, close to, like, the cook of Alice B. Toklas and Gertrude Stein, and I think that's an interesting, you get in there on the slant.
Person for the
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Have any of you thought about going farther back into history than you've written
The
about?
1990.
Yeah, yeah. I've started working on a hobo novel of around 1920.
Yeah.
So.
I'm writing an 1870 Western right now.
Ooh, you got me beat. Further back.
There's a question.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, hi.
Yeah, I had a related question, but looking through the other end of the lens. When I first started writing, my novel that I just published. I set it in.
What's the name? Plug it for us.
Blood and Soil.
Thank you.
Oh, I know what that's about.
Because it takes place at the end of the 1950s, very conservative time. And that meant it was after I was born. I was very conflicted about whether I was writing a historical novel, whether it would be delegitimized by being too recent, call it that, and whether I needed to worry at all about the gatekeepers who, in publishing, the people who bestow book awards, what have you, whether I was legitimately using genre, that rubric, to describe what I was writing, and if there is any sense here, and I know especially for you, you have changed my way of thinking about it, because the 90s are within everyone's memory, or most of us in this room. So I'm just wondering how you think about that aspect, because then, of course, we can talk about what happened 2 years ago. Is it historical? Does it even matter if we talk about that?
Well, the Historical Fiction Society defines historical fiction as anything before 1970. Now, I think they made that up, but that's what they say.
What made
I think,
San Francisco a unique and special place?
What was the question?
What made San Francisco unique and special in the 90s?
The question was what made
Yeah.
San Francisco unique and special in the 1990s, and not to be glib, but read the book, right? Is my first answer to that.
What's your second?
It's nice.
I think also, to go back to your question and the definition of historical fiction, I think of historical fiction as anything born before the writer's, anything that took place before the writer was born. That's how I personally think about it. Like, if I wasn't alert and awake to it, then it's history to me.
Mhm.
Because 1970 isn't kind of an arbitrary date from that society, right? Does it
It's
shift? Does it?
Historical Fiction Society, folks. I'm just telling you.
Yeah, so we contend with it as we go, Yeah.
There is an aspect.
I saw your hand back here. Yes.
Cheryl, where's my cowboy? How far along?
The Cowboys coming.
I'm trying to call you out. Hurry up, Cheryl.
The editor has it.
Christopher?
Can I ask a question of the group, which I don't think we've addressed? Can you all talk about over-researching and the pain of letting go of something that you researched so extensively and you realize this just isn't going to fit in a novel? I can't shoehorn it in here.
Oh, that's such a great one.
Mine is quick, and I said the last time I was here, so I don't know what I was researching on Google, but I got into it, and I go down the rabbit hole, and I'm in there about an hour, and the next thing I know, I'm look up, and I'm on the Paul Anka page on Google. And I'm thinking, what? I don't know what I was.
That is over-research, Cheryl.
I don't know. I couldn't fit it in.
In honesty, Paul Anka is pretty historical.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
thank you.
But it's painful too. It's like if there's something that you researched and you just love this fact and you wanted it to fit in and it just doesn't work with the story and you're like, oh, all this work and I just have to cut it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Or
I
put
mean-
it in the drawer.
Is that true of all writing?
Sure.
I mean, you do have to drown the kittens, as they say. Yeah.
Whether or not it works?
But if you're like a born researcher in your soul, or something that like fetishizes, loves research, loves the archives and
put
stuff
it
like
aside
that,
for
and
the
you
next
don't,
one?
and you get attached to
Yeah.
wanting to include something that maybe just doesn't work with the story.
If it keeps calling to you, that's the next book.
Yeah, that's the next book.
Yeah, that's a really good, that's the answer. It's like, yeah, we have our outtakes file. Right?
You had an answer to that.
Well, I was when I was writing The Perfume Thief, I wrote towards, so the Nazis needed something, so the thing I came up for them to need, the editor didn't like. And so we had a conversation before she even accepted the book and said, well, why are you, like, what? And and so she said, well, if we're going to work together on this book, then the Nazis need to want something else. That's not what they should want. And so, so I'm like, oh, okay. So, which I don't mind. I mean, I love writing. Like, I'm more interested in the active writing and the active researching than I am in the final product, really. And so, so yeah, so it was fun to go back into the book and reimagine all of that. And it did become something better. I mean, so with the perfume thief, and there's like related to chemical warfare and perfume, and I wasn't finding anything along those lines at first, but then I found just enough, just a little bit of a hint of some historical connection between perfume and chemical warfare in France that ended up being all I needed, really, to work from. So.
I want to ask if there's anyone who hasn't asked a question yet who wanted to. Well, we still have about 5 minutes left. Anyone got something on their mind? Okay, then we'll go to some repeats. Go ahead, sir, again.
I was struck in the kind of the discussion about what the boundaries of historical and versus non-historical fiction, and that got me to thinking about why is it necessary to designate a work of fiction as one type or another. You can think of the broadest categories as far as publishers are concerned, or an audience maybe, are literary fiction versus commercial fiction, and there are different rules and expectations for each. Once one has gotten those categories out of the way, why is it important that we designate our work as fitting into some category?
Bookstore placement is
It's just
it's
marketing.
bookstore placement.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, I never really thought of myself as when I started writing historical fiction, I didn't think of it as historical fiction. I thought of it as just writing about the past. And so it wasn't until the publisher tried to position it that it became part of that conversation.
Yeah, I had a similar experience. I didn't think about it in that way, really. Yeah. Oh, I'm going to go with.
I have a question. So, have you ever had the experience where you've done copious research and then you discover something that blows it all to shit? Like, I was writing a book, and the whole thing was predicated on this author who was writing a fiction novel based on a Willem de Kooning painting that had been stolen and never found. And I was 3/4 of the way through the book when they found the fucking thing. So, I mean, because that kind of stuff happens, right? Have you ever had that occur where you had to go back in and kind of recraft what you thought you understood in the light of incredible information?
I have not personally.
I don't think so.
It sounds familiar, but I can't think of when but I do feel like I did. I learned something hinged on something, and then later discovered that just was not. When I learned more about it, I realized, oh no, this is a misrepresentation, or it's historically inaccurate, and it's just not going to work. So I can't remember what that instance was.
You
But
could write it as alternative history.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's the
I mean, you should write it anyway.
Spec fiction.
Yeah.
Right here, please.
So I'm curious about what you wrote about what the Nazis needed that you had.
Yeah, me too.
it was a vessel. Well, this is exactly the thing.
The vessel with the pestle?
Originally, my sense of the Nazis was based on Raiders of the Lost Ark, and so I had the whole like religious iconography thing and the relics and all of that. The Nazis didn't really care about religious relics, but I did. But ultimately, the Nazis in my book did, and they wanted this vessel that held. I can't remember the perfume that Mary anointed Christ's feet with the perfume. I'm drawing a blank on the name of it. And so I wanted the Nazis to want this vessel, this perfume vessel, and that's how the perfume thief comes into play and all of that. And yeah, and she didn't like it. And so.
So what do they want instead?
So then they suggested the chemical warfare, make a chemical warfare connection, which was hard to make, but then I finally did. But.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, we got the 5-minute warning, so you. Yeah.
I just have a question about language. So language has changed a lot in the past even 2 decades, right? Like actor, actress, aviator, how much attention do you pay to language in making that language specific to the era in your work?
Around gender? Because your two examples were
Well, just in
gender.
general, I mean,
Okay.
Gender is the first thing that comes to my mind, but I feel like there's probably a lot of difference in language over the past few decades.
Yeah, I mean, it can sound stiff, right? If you take up the language of the time, or it can sound precious, or so. And you're writing for contemporary readers, and so, or modern day readers. So, so yeah, I don't pay too much attention to the language of the day and how people talked, or my characters talk like I talk. So.
I found that especially in the 1948 section, I was in my dialogue having a bit of a snappy Rosalind Russell kind of noir flavor, and what's that to do with the price of peas?
Yes.
And, I mean, I just made that up, but I thought, oh, that sounds kind of Rosalind Russell, or one of those. So I had those films to kind of soak in, but who knows how accurate, especially I think with dialogue, it gets really slippery.
Yeah.
But you do want to avoid just crazy howlers, like probably, you don't want to have the subtleties of the pronoun sphere, in your book set in 1964, that kind of thing.
A book I recommend is Rob Osler, who's a queer writer in San Francisco. He writes a series with a lesbian private eye, and his newest book, The Case of the Murdered Muckraker, set in 1890. He does such a great job with the language of the 1890s, and you can as you're reading it, you go like, oh, that's so old-fashioned, but he does so well weaving it together that it doesnn't bother you. In fact, it's kind of lilting and lovely.
One of the things that I was trying to do in You Can Say You Knew Me When was have the character in 1960 has done this very cliche thing of going to San Francisco because he read On the Road and wanted to be a beatnik kind of thing, right? And decides he's going to write his own novel. And I thought, how am I going to try to represent the language that this guy was writing, using? And so what I did was I went back and I found kind of primary source letters, versus scholarship about the time or movies about the time. I tried to find actual letters and steal language from those letters so that would sound authentic. And then I think later you could then go, all right, I went back and kind of revised and thought, is this sounding almost too stuck in the past and obscure, and do I want to maybe nudge it a little bit more towards today for contemporary audiences? So I do think it's not like a fixed rule around it. Like try to capture the language of the time, and then maybe think about any translation you might do to let it.
And I'll say the flip side of that is I wrote a short fiction story using the pronouns they, and I had the hardest time writing that stuff. And I kept putting her in there, and I kept, when people, even when I thought it was finished, editors were going like, no, there's still a she in there, and I'm going, okay, it was just, I felt like a pretzel, trying to do that.
I mean, we are just dealing with language all the time, every sentence, right? So this is, I think, you contend with that sentence by sentence sometimes, yeah.
The existing references that we have for the past, letters, television, films, recordings, they're all going to be more formal, and they're all going to be more stiff than people actually talk. So in doing dialogues, like if you just imitate the way people wrote in letters, your dialogue's going to come off stiff. So you have to finesse it and soften it.
Although there's some, sources, like the Library of Congress archives have letters that are personal letters. I think that's authentic language of the time,
Sure.
There's also an archive called StoryCorps where they invite people to come in and talk about certain subjects, and I love the language that comes from real people talking about the things that matter to them.
Well, that's why oral history is
That's
history. It's the stuff.
That's right.
That's our time. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you, Carl.
You gotta get a picture with Jewel.
That was so fun.
Her thing.